This show is a part of the FM Podcast Network, the home of great music podcasts. Visit us at fmpods.com.
Welcome to another episode of Infinity Goes Up on Trial. I'm your host, Erin Callahan, and today my guest is, yet again, Carney, historian, Bob Dylan scholar, Woody Guthrie scholar, and all-around amazing human being. We're here to talk about his book, Reckoning with the Devil, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Myth and Memory, that comes out on September 17th. I'll put the link to buy it in the show notes. You can pre-order it. I highly recommend it. It was a great book. I loved reading it.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here, by the way.
Again, yes,
Yeah.
Thank you. I was nodding along at the introduction, and you said all around great human being, and I'm just like, yeah. I didn't mean to.
I mean, no, but it's true.
We'll nod along.
You're one of my favorite people.
There
what
we
can
go.
I say?
Thank you.
Yeah, I loved your book, and I think I texted you when I was done with it how much I loved it, and I can't stress enough that when we were talking yesterday, I said I would literally stop and say, this is a really fucking great book. And so I'm so proud of you as my friend and as a historian.
That's all we want to hear
Yeah.
it's very, very kind. Thank you.
So I'm actually grateful that you let me read it before it came out, but I will still buy it.
Yes, well.
And I'll buy it, which is important. And I'll buy it for my dad too, because I think he'll love it. And so in the introduction, let's get down to questions. You write that you lived with Nathan Bedford Forrest for a long time. And so when did you first become interested in him?
Whew. There's a lot
far back did
it's
you
a
go?
lot to unpack here.
Right.
But when I was writing the introduction, I was thinking about this. Like I had this idea in my mind of how I wanted to present Forrest, and I started thinking, I was like, this is someone that I have known a very long time, and it's not like Dylan, where you're like, what an amazingly upbeat, wonderful, life-giving person you're engaged with your entire life. This is someone who's reflective of very dark energy. And I started thinking, like, he is someone I've lived with a long time. And I think that there's a couple ways of looking at it, but one is actually, strangely enough, it was a college research paper I wrote in the 90s on Fort Pillow. Mm-hmm. And it's just one of those things that comes up. You had to come up with a research assignment for a Civil War class, and somehow I found that, and I wrote probably a passable paper on it, just looking at it. But that was sort of that happened around the time when I was applying for grad programs. And so I had this idea that something was there, not Fort Pillow itself, but like the idea of like Forrest was interesting me, even at that stage, but only, I shouldn't say only, but for the most part in terms of how he was conceptualized by others. Mm-hmm. That's the interest for me. And so even from that very early stage, I was like, okay, something's there. And then I went to graduate school at LSU, and I started talking to a professor, Gaines Foster, who was at LSU, and he had been one of the two kind of primary architects of sort of the historiography of the Lost Cause. And we're getting to the word historiography very early in this.
I know.
The viewership is just exploding.
Pause. Google.
Yeah, they're like, this is amazing. But he wrote a book that was a decade old, at least I guess around that time, on the construction of the myths around the Civil War. Right. And so that dovetailed with sort of what I was thinking. And so my master's thesis was the seedbed of what becomes the book X number of years later.
Gotcha.
So my master's thesis was Forrest, and then the master's thesis itself was looking primarily at Memphis. And Memphis is I guess for people who don't know, the landscape of Forrest, Nathan Bedford Forrest, is centered in large measure on Memphis. He's not born in Memphis, but he becomes sort of a part of the Memphis story. And in 1905, you have a statue built to him, and which also serves as his gravesite. And that became sort of what I was interested in. That story is what I was interested in telling as a master's thesis. And so the master's thesis was 1998. So that
that's chapter 2.
So
I
20,
think.
yeah.
So that's what sort of you
a quarter century ago plus. Yeah.
So you were interested because you that's what sparked your interest. You saw that you did this research paper and there was something there beyond just Fort Pillow.
Yes, and there's a story. The other part that's really important to this story is an author that is sort of routinely dismissed within the Forrest world, and that's a guy named Andrew Lytle, who was a part of the Southern Fugitives and the Southern Agrarians, the Fugitives, and he was also part of the Vanderbilt story. And he writes a book on Forrest in the 30s, and it's a wild story, and it's a story that most people sort of dismiss because he's not so serious with some of the military stuff, but he's very important in terms of kind of manufacturing this sort of larger than life character. And so I saw that as the real story of like, well, how do we kind of construct this guy? Right. And that then becomes sort of the background hum of everything I've kind of been doing.
So you made a point, and this is a question I didn't include in the original questions, but now I'm thinking back to our conversations that you like dealing with such a dark figure for such a for such a long time. Did that weigh on you?
I think that.
Like, how does it affect you? Because writing about Dylan is joyful.
Well, there's a lot of different things, and so like the master's thesis was on Forrest. The dissertation was on jazz in the 20s. Mm-hmm. And that is something that is, again, infinitely fun to talk about, and you can go deep into it and be like, oh, this is cool, and you can have, those epiphanies and stuff. With Forrest, I think it was, my view on Forrest over the years has become way more complex. And I think that one of the things, we've talked a little bit about this, but one of the things that I think people get wrong with him is that people on either side or on every side of the issue sort of reduce him in certain ways. And this isn't me trying to build him up at all. It's simply saying that there's not a really simplistic way of kind of dealing with him. I think he's a very challenging figure. And I think that living with him that long and dealing with these issues, I think you get a sense of like a kind of a sense of how he's being used, and you can kind of see very easily when you're reading newspaper clips or other books that get written of him, you can kind of see how he's malleable. Right. And I think that's where I've kind of strengthened those kind of muscles. Mm-hmm. I think that he hasn't completely driven me down into the darkest, most dire parts of it, but there does inside of the image of Forrest, there's a lot of terrible stuff, right. And that part I think gets kind of either dismissed or maybe glossed in a different way over time.
What makes him so complicated?
He's complicated because I think that on some level Forrest is not complicated. I should say that. On one level, Forrest was from the rural South, he's born in the middle of kind of nowhere, Tennessee. He ends up becoming a farmer in North Mississippi, and then he goes into Memphis. And I think his story is both very common when we look at it, but then every step of the way, there's like an uncommon piece to it. So it's the white rural South, and then how that becomes part of this story leading up to the Civil War. And then he's in the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, he's trying to rebuild his life. Well, those stories have been told infinite number of times. Right. But what makes him complicated is that he then gets engaged not simply with enslaved labor, but he ends up getting engaged very early on with the trading of individuals. And so he is part of the money-making process of slavery. So the term we would have used throughout most of the 20th century is a slave trader. And then looking at how he made his money was through that. So not just simply connected to slavery on a labor issue, but using it as a way to enrich himself through the trade. In terms of the Civil War, he enters the Civil War fairly late. He's 40 when he enters the Civil War, and he is a private for a very short period of time, and then he goes up the ranks, and he's using, one thing that I argue is that he's actually using the slave trade to his advantage.
You connected the pre-war and the war activities.
Because what happens is people say, well, he was just, preternaturally good at commanding.
Right.
And I think there might be a little bit of that. He has a mind for it. I think that part is true. He's untrained. He doesn't have a West Point background or anything like that. But what he does have in West Tennessee in particular, he has a huge network of people. And this network includes mostly what he was doing in terms of the slave trade. And so in that first year of the war, in particular, but throughout the war, he's able to tap these networks. And you can just kind of see that he's able to make sure his troops get resources or whatever it is. And he also, as a lot of people did at the same time, he knows the land really well. That doesn't make him unique. But I think this kind of unique part of the slave trade leading into the Civil War, I think is unique. And then after the Civil War, as he's rebuilding his life, he then gets connected to the first iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. And so then that's what I'm saying. This story that has been told and retold a million times is also very densely packed. So he's not just connected to this one thing. He's connected to this really dark underbelly piece. He's not just connected to the Civil War. He's connected to Fort Pillow, which is a site where there's an uncommonly large number of black deaths. And then he is also engaged not just in rebuilding his life through railroads or insurance, but he's also doing it as the head of the Ku Klux Klan. So he's sort of a flashpoint on each of these points.
Yeah. And as I was reading, I saw a lot of parallels to Faulkner's Snopes family, Thomas Sutpen. I mean, there's a lot of Faulkner, like the Mississippi Memphis. I mean, they kept conjuring up those images of the figures that populate Faulkner's novels.
And Faulkner uses Forrest
in
a couple of short stories.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a piece there, and none of this is valorizing him at all. I'm just simply saying that there's so many different pieces where when we get to the question as to why is he magnetic to certain parts of the white South, these are the reasons why he's magnetized in a certain way. And I think it complicates every step of the process. So when he's a complicated person, he himself is as complicated as any human being, I suppose. But in terms of his image and the way it's being built, there are all these different hinges that make him much more complicated to work with.
So that's fair. I mean, but that kind of leads into my next question. So your overall analysis of Forrest focuses on identity and how identity of a public figure is constructed through memory and how that memory helps create a certain mythology around the figure. So without giving too much of the novel away, let's don't just sit here and read it because I want people to buy it and read it themselves. But can you tell me about that analysis, the framework? The
story, I am a cultural historian, and the story of Forrest to me is a story of culture. I think it's a story of cities. I think it's a story of the 20th century South. And I say that because I write about the military stuff, but I am not a military historian, and I rely on military historians when I'm writing that material, but that's not the bulk of the book. I need to give a biography of the person. I need to give some sort of context for the person, but the story is not a story of 4 years of fighting. The story is really Memphis in 1905, 30 years after he's dead. The story is Nashville in the 1990s. The story is Ken Burns' The Civil War. The story is how do we learn about the Civil War? How do we kind of manufacture the Civil War? How do we imagine the Civil War? That's the story. And so the breakdown then of the book is looking at what are the moments that make Forrest. Sometimes in the first chapter, he's alive. So it's about how the media shapes him, how he's using the media to shape himself. then there's the chapter on Memphis in 1905 when you have the people who are building the monument to him for the first time and what that means and where they're coming from and what their expectations are. Then you have a story of writers, historians, mostly untrained and then trained, looking at how these different biographers and scholars are using, history to tell this story. And then, that chapter, history as fiction, fiction as history. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like this blurring of everything. And that goes into, I think, the more intriguing chapter, and that's the chapter on body. It's how Forrest's body is part of the conversation.
Man ever.
Most man in the world.
Oh, yeah, most man in the world.
Yeah, that's a quote from Shelby Foote that just follows us around for so long, and it's a conversation about the physicality of Forrest. Mm-hmm. It's a story of the sexuality of Forrest, which I think might raise an eyebrow, but it's all there from the beginning of these really intricate threads of sexuality. Mm-hmm. And then the end of the book is looking at how these monuments then come down. When I first worked with Forrest, the story was these monuments were either around for 90 years or they were newly erected. And when I first started working on the book a long time ago, in terms of like the idea of the book, they were all still part of our world. And it wasn't until 2017 when the monuments come down that you have like a different story. I don't recommend telling your editor to wait until everything changes to deliver the manuscript. But that's what happened. So as 2017 comes around and the statue of Memphis comes down, and then a little bit later the statue of Nashville comes down, outside of Nashville comes down, that then becomes the final part of the book. Whether it's the final part of the story is yet to be seen, but it's the final part of the book.
And I think your conclusion kind of alludes to that they're taken down now and they're stored somewhere, so that's where they are for now, but we don't know what happens next. Right.
Well, one's destroyed basically because it falls apart, but the other one's in a storage.
Yeah, the 1998.
Not to give it away, but everyone's favorite Forrest statue outside of Memphis is no longer with us.
So when we think about this type of history, it's a different type of analysis than than you made that distinction of, it's not military history, it's not sort of a straight history. So what is the importance of cultural history to telling the overall story?
Well, I think cultural history provides this more kind of fluid look at kind of how it's constructed, because you're looking at audience, but you're also looking at the creators of this material too. So like, as Forrest is on every single page of the book, and you can imagine indexing Forrest, but like a little index humor for everybody. But when you're dealing with Forrest, is actually weirdly not the focal point, right? It's people like Shelby Foote. It's people like Andrew Lytle. It's people who are creating this material. So what cultural history allows you to do is play with these forms and this apparatus, while also looking at how it's being received and how all of these things kind of combine to make something sort of slippery. Because I think ultimately it is slippery. The Forrest image takes shape at different times, sometimes in bronze in 1905, but it also takes shape and has a meaning to it at these different junctures. And cultural history then allows us to kind of create that map in a way that I think answers, or at least tries to answer, questions beyond the battlefield.
So we tend to accept history as sort of fact, and there's an objective element to it, but what is, like how you're talking about folks like Lytle and Foote, how do their subjectivity help shape the image of
It's all of that. Ultimately, I'm not going to sit here and say that facts don't matter in this case, but like it's the myth that matters, and how people perceive this, and how people sort of connect their lives to this material, which may or may not have any factual basis. So with Forrest, what's really unusual about, if you're dealing with someone just within the Civil War, like Grant or Lee or any of these people, you have a body of work you can play with. What makes Forrest, again, complicated or challenging is that he's not writing his memoirs. He doesn't have, a lot of material from him.
Right.
He's using aides de camp, and he's using secretaries. He has a comment after the war where he's like he's writing letters or he's dictating letters to all these different people. Mm-hmm. But it's not like we have a body of work. We have a book that comes out during his life, 1868, that is mostly Civil War related, and it's interesting in terms of what that book tells us because he would have seen it. We know that he would have at least approved in theory about this. But what we don't have is a bunch of like his letters or anything. So the internal mind of Forrest is not all that clear cut. And so it's about how people perceive these events. One of the most famous examples that comes up is Shelby Foote loves the story of, there was a battle. It's Shiloh, which is a very famous battle. But at the end of Shiloh, there's this little sort of skirmish that happens at a place called Fallen Timbers. And in the story, which doesn't really show up until decades after Forrest dies, is that he is shot or the horse is shot or some combination, and he picks up a Union soldier and uses him as a human shield. But that story evolves over time. Mm-hmm. And fact there doesn't really matter. I mean, Fallen Timbers happened, Forrest was there, that happened, Shiloh happened. But that story itself, but it becomes the story. The story then is this mythic story that Shelby Foote tells time and time again to the point where people know practically only that. And I think that is part of it. Fort Pillow, again, it is a battle. It is a siege that happens. We know all these different pieces, but it's so shrouded in mystery. We ultimately don't know all what went down in that one day in April in 1864. We just simply don't have enough evidence. We have lots of different stories, but they compete against each other. And these stories, if you're going to say it's a massacre, there's a lot of compelling evidence to support that. But there's also evidence to support that massacre is a very pat term that doesn't really maybe have all of the different nuance of what happened. Right. We know a lot of terrible things went down, but sometimes it's very difficult to sort of label these stories in a particular way as people would want them to. For most of the 20th century, it's people trying to write it off as nothing.
Right.
But then you have people who kind of pick up other things, and then these stories are maybe a little exaggerated on the other side. And I think that what happens is that this is where the story becomes, from a writer perspective, a lot more interesting, because you're basically saying, well, where do you fall on the scale here, and how are you creating this story? And then what I'm doing is creating the story of these other stories.
That's my next question, is like, how did your subjectivity, or did your subjectivity influence your analysis of Forrest, or the stories surrounding Forrest?
This is the part where there's probably some change, not in terms of my belief or what I believe happened, but I think what I was becoming more comfortable with and what I was becoming more adept to was this idea of how we can create, how do we allow these different stories to exist without completely being either dismissive of or trying to put them on a scale of fact. You can put them on a scale of believability.
Right.
That part you can play with. But it's not really, I was not ever all that interested in saying, well, this is clearly not true. Look at, gotcha, how dare you repeat this? I was more interested in like, well, why is this story keep popping up? And why is this story not? You know, there are stories that you, if you're going to try to defend him, there are plenty of stories you could use to do, but those stories never really cohere. But then there's this other kind of thing of like, well, why does this sort of, if you get into Andrew Lytle, there's a whole thing of like chickens. He goes back to this chicken story over and over again. It's like, why was that so compelling? Mm-hmm. And it's compelling because he's trying to tell a story of the frontier. Mm-hmm. But then why does that get picked up decades later? Like, why does that become In other words, one of my ideas was, and one of the things I was really interested in is like, why do some things cohere to Forrest over a long period of time, and why do some things just kind of fall off, and why do some things within the image and the myths kind of change? And that was where I was coming at it. I was less interested in like, well, this clearly never happened. I was more interested in like, well, why do you have an investment into why it happened? You think it happened?
I think you do a good job striking the balance, but also looking at the different strands of those stories, like the one where the jaguar rips his mother's skin off, or it's really interesting. There's a plug for the book, right? Yeah. But I think, so one of my favorite stories, I think that those stories too, the one of his mother and also of his wife, those are helping to, as you say, construct his masculinity. And you had referred to that a little while ago about his sexuality. And one of my by far favorite stories in the book is this story in Stag magazine. So can we talk about that, please?
When you introduce something as like, can we get to Stag magazine?
Can we just talk about Stag magazine?
Stag magazine.
It's so mid-century too, mid-20th century.
If we want to pull back, so there's a couple things that happen. And there's a couple of research trips, and I had taken a lot of research trips to Memphis over the years, and I had gone to Nashville when I was actually in the process of actually constructing the book. And Nashville gave me two very important things. It gave me, the Vanderbilt Archives has Andrew Lytle's papers, which are sort of untouched. And there's a lot of stuff in there that every 10 minutes I was like, oh, well, this is going in the book. Oh, a book proposal for Forrest that he writes at 29 years old or whatever that doesn't mention Forrest. It's all this ideological Revolutionary War stuff. It's interesting. And the second thing Nashville gave me is that the state archives there in Nashville have a clippings folder. And the clippings folder, again, it's kind of a mid-century dated thing.
Are these things you're texting me? The little like the cartoons and the things.
Right. So I get these clippings, and then they had a collection of stuff in Nashville by a research assistant, and there's a biographer of Forrest in the 40s, and he ends up connecting somehow to this guy named Monroe Cockrell, who's in Chicago or in some part of Chicago, and somehow or another, this guy is exactly what a researcher needs. He is collecting all of these things. We're finding ads. He's collecting ads that mention Forrest from like yachting magazines and lifesaver commercials and all of this stuff. And he's just collecting it. He's not saying anything about it. He's just like excited that Forrest exists in this world of advertising. And one of the things that was in this clippings folder was this like Stag magazine piece. And Stag magazine was like a men's sort of, their story. They'd have like action adventure stuff. It'd be after World War II, so they'd have lots of, as it was at the time, lots of submarine stories and intrigue and sort of sexy or sexy adjacent stories. But this story is based on the Johnsonville, Tennessee raid because he mentions it, but it has nothing really to do with it. And it is in the parlance of the magazine, a camp follower, and this would have been through the innuendo would have been a black enslaved woman who would have been in the Confederate world, but was working kind of as a spy. And then she is going and taking treats to the Union soldiers to get information from them. And that whole thing becomes the crux of basically Forrest sort of in love with her, or she's sort of in love with him. And it's a real tricky balance that they're playing. And it's not erotic, and there's a novel that comes out that's very similar to this.
I was going to say, not as much so as Bell's novel.
Oh, yeah. Madison Smart Bell writes a novel that is really, really like...
I was scandalized.
It's...
I was not.
It's like, there's language in there that you don't think you're typing and you're writing a book on Forrest. But this story, the Stag magazine story, is also, in terms of the iconography, they have a drawing, a painting, I guess, that's reproduced. That Forrest looks kind of like Forrest. You can kind of tell it's Forrest. Mm-hmm. But then the woman is sort of like an ambiguously ethnic woman, but it's all very sort of pin-up-y and, tantalizing. And this is where you're kind of, the actual story of camp followers or enslaved men and women who are working with the Confederacy is a very, very complicated, very, very difficult story to kind of just tell.
Right.
And then to tell it as a romance or as this sort of
consensual romance.
Right. She's clearly into him. It's shocking. And so what I was able to do is I got the Stag magazine, but then Cockrell is writing these letters because Cockrell is in Chicago collecting all this stuff. Some of it gets into books, but most of it doesn't. He just collects it, then he gets his stuff over somehow to the State Archives in Nashville. And it was just a ton of stuff where Cockrell is constantly concerned about how Forrest is seen. Mm-hmm. And he thinks Stag in this article is insulting.
So an
he hates
early
it.
Cultural historian.
Right,
Yeah.
of the sense.
Yeah.
He's kind of like a scrapbooker who then becomes very just like angry. And I think there's something else we talk about too, where there is a movie that was going to be made, and Cockrell hears about it. And he writes the guy at Warner Brothers and is like, "You got to do this, but you got to get the gun right. You got to get the sword right. You got to get this right." And the other guy's like, "Okay, man, this sure.
Thanks.
The film's not going to be made, and it's not going to be made like this is. It's not that kind of movie,
Right.
So Cockrell is actually. I know nothing really about him. I know just a little bit, but he was sort of the MVP of the research side because he's just collecting all this. How he finds it pre-internet is crazy. Mm-hmm. Sailing magazines, milk. There's a milk producers monthly that uses fusses with the mostest, and he goes.
Yeah.
So he collects all that stuff. So that's where
cool.
all that goes stuff.
Another interesting detail, more serious and not as salacious, is that of Joseph Smitherman as Mayor of Selma. And it's sort of, as I've said in my questions, it seems to flatten time and demonstrate how little has progressed. And can you just tell us a little bit about that?
So the mayor of Selma in Alabama is the mayor off and on for decades. And what that means is that he's there for like the 65 Selma March. And he's a part of like blocking and helping block and helping obstruct the civil rights march in Selma. But then later in life, he's also there for the construction of the Forrest. There's a small Forrest bust that's put up in Selma. And I think that he's interesting because, and what you're saying is interesting because Forrest can seem hopelessly from another time. But what I argue, honestly, is that the reason why Forrest actually has resonance is because he's sort of modern. I think Forrest, his look is sort of modern. He has a certain look about him that does not look like a throwback. I'm not saying he's a modernist at all in many ways, but I think he can be used in a way that you're like, I know that guy. I've seen that guy. Mm-hmm. And I think that what that does is that he's not from a long time ago. So when you have one person as mayor who's able to cross the civil rights movement and then the building of a, whatever it was in the 1990s or very early 2000s, the statue, it's like it's the same guy. Right. But this happens a lot with Forrest. So like Forrest, his the pens where he would keep the enslaved men, women, children, families before he was selling them. That space is now a parking lot of a church, but it borders now B.B. King Boulevard. Mm-hmm. And it's like one of these things of like, B.B. King Boulevard is now where Forrest would have lived, or the Forrest statue is between the black hospital that King would have been taken to after he was shot, and where Sun Records is. It's all this sort of difficult landscape of the modern South, where you have sort of this, especially in a place like Memphis, you have this layering of black history and white history and these contact points. And when you're seeing, well, this is something from the 1850s, which is representative of the slave trade, is also like, well, now it's sort of like B.B. King Boulevard. Mm-hmm. And you see this a lot too with this flattening of time. I mentioned this as an aside in the book, but Forrest Gump, which is the one kind of connecting piece that people might have outside of the Civil War.
Never seen it.
Never seen Forrest Gump. But Forrest Gump is in the book named for Forrest. In the movie,
I learned that from your book.
In the movie, Tom Hanks is digitally his face is put on top of a clip from Birth of a Nation, which is based again on Forrest as a Klansman. And then that all exists, but then what's interesting is that then you have the Elvis movie, the Baz Luhrmann Elvis movie. There's a very throwaway scene where one of the racist senators, they show his office, and off in the corner is the famous portrait of Forrest. And so again, another Tom Hanks sort of universe, not to drag him into all this, but it's like, well, that's kind of a flattening too. And I felt like the meme when I was in the theater watching Elvis, I felt like the meme of,
Yeah.
Did everyone else catch that? Well, in the movie there, did you all see 26 minutes in? But I think that's an interesting way how it becomes like he flattens time and history in that way, but it also sort of, he's as good, and this is where cultural history works too, because he becomes like a symbol, a signifier for all these little things. So you don't have to say much, but you can put that picture there, or you can represent this. Now, what's interesting with we don't want to get entangled in the Forrest Gump stuff, but Forrest Gump, that stuff was pretty absent from the way people talked about that movie.
Right.
Everyone talks about all the other pieces of it. And as a film, they talk about the construction of it in these different ways. No one's really talking about, well, the entry point to Forrest Gump is the Klan. That's the whole story of it.
Right.
But at the time, that wasn't a big part of what people talked about.
Maybe you should. So you end the book. You conclude
In the
it
book,
with,
it's
you
over.
end it. You conclude with the Forrest statues being removed, the busts as well. And that's in Justin Pearson's book too. Taking down the statues and the bust. So what's the importance of the removals?
I think the removals are important for a couple of reasons. One, I think that people have a weird idea about removals, because if you ask people who don't like the removals, they'll say that every Civil War monument came down. Very small number did, but some of the famous ones did come down. And I think people tend to think, well, this is like, we removed all of these things. And it's like, well, not really. Secondly, what's important is that if we take the Memphis story, Memphis puts up the statue in 1905, the city does. It's on civic property. The removal is actually very complicated because the city kind of wanted it every way. By the 1990s, they give the land over to a university, so it's university land, not city property. It's visible from every angle of the city, but then it's not their property anymore. It's all these interesting little things that happen up. The other part of the Memphis story is that you have an internal sort of beginning, an origin point of black activism against it. Now that doesn't begin then. It's been there for a long time. But the other myth that people have is that, well, no one was there saying these monuments shouldn't go up. But that's not true. In the 1970s, when the state Capitol in Nashville puts up a bust of Forrest, you have black activists at the time saying this is ridiculous, but they get written out of the story. And so then 40 years later, or 50 years later almost, people are like, well, no one said, no, they did. This was not new.
Right.
But the thing about Forrest is you have a woman named Tammy Sawyer who is a black activist in Memphis, and she was connecting the kind of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that Black Lives Matter movement, how it then crested in Memphis. She uses Forrest as the focal point, the Forrest statue, and she calls, after Tamir Rice is killed, or not after the officers are acquitted in December of 2015 from the Tamir Rice shooting, she then calls a protest at the Forrest meeting, at the Forrest statue, and that then leads to a 2-year breakdown of the stalemate. And then after 2 years, Forrest, which seemed like it was always going to be there, then isn't. He's gone. The Nashville statue is a little different because the Nashville statue is completely on private land. It's private property, but it's seen from the highway south of Nashville. So it was very visible, but it was on private property. And so the complications of civic property that becomes university property, which becomes something more ambiguous vis-a-vis than private statue on private property. It's a very different story. And basically what happens is that the person who created the statue dies. The person who owns the land then sort of didn't really keep it up. And then he dies. And then it's given to a trust. And the trust is like, we don't want it. And so then gone.
Yeah.
So it's like these two different stories that end with and that's the one that it's made of kind of polyurethane. So it's sort of, it breaks apart and it doesn't exist anymore in any real way. But the Memphis one is in a warehouse somewhere.
And one of my favorite sentences in the book is the sentence you wrote about that statue. So maybe other folks will be able to pick that out. But,
the Nashville statue?
Yeah. The Hobby Lobby eyes.
The Nashville statue is the one that most people represent as like, well, that's what the Confederate monument looks like, because it's garish, it's silver and gold and spray painted. But
it's also, rather than the one in Memphis, which is, the horse isn't, reared up and he's not, cocking his weapon. He seems a little bit more docile.
Well,
Memphis. You can say that about Forrest?
Memphis it's measured. The Memphis statue was a bronze statue that looks like a bronze statue you see all over the place, where the horse is there. It was modeled on one of his real horses. The statue is 3/4 size, so it's like based on Forrest. It was also his gravesite. They reburied Forrest and his wife in front of it, which also complicated the removal too, because then it became a gravesite, and so then you can't do that. So it was all these different kind of layers on that. The Forrest statue in Nashville is the one people know, where the horse is reared back. He's got a saber and a gun, and he's yelling, and it's much more aggressive.
Right. I think the book was great.
Thank you.
I thank you so much for sharing and talking with me, but I would love to shift to Dylan, as I like to do, because I think there are parallels that we can make between how the myth and the memory of Forrest is being used in sort of a public space and the way that we talk about Dylan. And so in the beginning of your book, as I said, you discussed how much Forrest cultivated his public identity through the media. And I think this is sort of a tongue-in-cheek question, because I would answer yes, but do you think Dylan has done that, and how? That's like, do you think, of course he has, but how has he done it? I think is the question I want to get to.
I think one of the things that people don't realize about people like Forrest is how aware, that's why I say he's kind of modern.
Yeah.
He was very aware of his image when he was alive, and he was very good at cultivating it. So his aides de camp, the people who worked as adjutants and stuff for him in camp, were journalists. And he knew all the Memphis journalists, and they worked for him. They had Atlanta journalists for him. And so he was using them. And then after Fort Pillow, when all of a sudden you start seeing the newspaper coverage there, he's aware of all of this, but he's not annoyed. He loves it. He's creating this character, because he's using that on the battlefield too, because he wanted to be seen as ferocious and scary, and it worked. Was Forrest consciously creating a mask of Forrest? There might be something to that. Dylan certainly does, and if we look at those early...
But the term used, like creating a character, I mean, Dylan is doing the same thing early on.
Right, and it's interesting, like, how does Dylan use history? How does he sort of... I think there's this interesting point. If you look at those early interviews, and we've talked a little bit about this idea of like, is he trying to get away with something?
Right.
Is he trying to really avoid his past or vacate his past?
Cynthia Gooding, the Studs Terkel, those kind of interviews.
Right.
Pre-Newsweek, that kind of outs him.
There's the idea that he was in Gallup, New Mexico, and he was with the circus, and he was with the carnival, and he was these things. Was he doing that because from the very beginning he had a distrust of the media? Maybe. He certainly becomes distrustful of it.
Right.
But then maybe it's also something, more playful. Forrest is a lot of things. Forrest isn't really playful. We don't have a lot of playfulness within. There's a lot of playfulness what you can do with Forrest, but Forrest as a character is not playful.
I would love to see the X account, Nathan Bedford Forrest smiling, like the Bob Dylan smiling. I don't think that would have...
Well, one thing that you brought up, and I think it's interesting to talk about, is also like the media piece, but also like how Dylan is constructing his persona. And one thing, and we talked about this before the filming, but I think is really intriguing that you brought up, was the idea of dialect. And the one thing I think is curious is that with Andrew Lytle, he is using a version of Southern dialect badly to sort of create this world of believability for Forrest, and it doesn't really work. But I have the pages that he's writing, and you can see where he uses the word panther, and then he goes back and literally crosses out and takes the H out and says panther.
Yeah.
Children becomes chillin'.
Yeah.
And I think that he's using this dialect, and sometimes it's just rural Southern, white Southern, black Southern, and then sometimes it's dialect for black Southern. But he's using it in a really kind of terrible way at various times, but he's sort of play acting. He wants it to be sort of, he's a Vanderbilt graduate, clearly, who's using this language to kind of give a flavor to Forrest. With Dylan, the one thing I was thinking about is when you're looking at the early part where he's kind of dropping, syllables, and he's sort of, the apostrophes come in, and the sort of the Guthrie world. What I was thinking is Timothy Hampton, who we saw give that talk in Tulsa, but he also in his book talks about the hobo voice, right? Where Dylan's borrowing this sort of particular patois to create a form of authenticity. I think it gets really interesting because, the inauthentic becomes then the gateway to being perceived as authentic. And I think there's a lot of kind of challenging pieces there, but Dylan's clearly doing that on purpose.
Right.
And at some point he stops, but he clearly is doing that in a certain way. And I think when people write about Forrest, they want to use some of this language too to kind of give them some, the author some sort of power. And so Madison Smart Bell, who writes The Devil's Dream, which is a really fascinating, I'll use the word fascinating, novel about Forrest that's very laden with sexual terms, he's using dialect in a much more nuanced way. It's very interesting.
But is the difference though, like Lytle is a historian, and he and the rest of the fugitives or the agrarians, and you write about that in your book, are using the dialect and kind of putting that on Forrest from a historical perspective. So they're writing the history in that dialect. I think it's different when you're creating a persona or a voice in a novel, and then someone isn't doing that for Dylan. He's doing that on his own. There's a sense of agency to it.
I think it's interesting though, and I think it's interesting in terms of, is it mimicry? Because some people would say it's mimicry.
Right.
Is he singing it because you have someone who actually is from Oklahoma singing it that way? What is Guthrie? Guthrie is also presenting himself in a certain way and wanting to look a certain way. And I think all of these things are very sort of nuanced. I think maybe that's the way of saying it. It's like, are they complicated? Sometimes, but it's also nuanced. But also what the agrarians are doing, and you can see this too, is that they're talking to one another, and I have the letters to show that they're using
Christmas cards.
Very terrible black, comical versions of, degrading versions of black dialect to each other. And so then that gives you the key that there's something else going on there, that this is like it's not just play acting, there's a racial element with that. But it's also this idea, so Madison Smart Bell is able to do it in a more crafty way, and it makes it seem much more in the Faulknerian tradition of using language in a way that makes you know that this is language from a space, a place.
Right.
That's different. But then there's also this idea that they're creating a world where they want a believable Forrest, and then what Dylan's doing is actually kind of something different. He's kind of, it's not to be believable that way, but if you take it back to his idea of trying to avoid, or to not avoid, but to void his past, then maybe that's very much a part of that too, where he's like, I'm just constructing this whole new vocabulary, language, that if he's called out on it, which I don't think he really is early on, it's kind of like, well, where is that coming from?
Right.
I think the Dylan story is obviously a very different element here. But I think it's interesting when you're using a form of dialect, and in some ways you're using a form of Southern dialect in this way to kind of craft a story of trying to get the audience either to believe you, or what in Dylan's point being the confidence man of like an unreliable narrator, which is also Dylan in 62 and 63 and 2024.
But But you brought in dialect, which was one of my questions, and that was where I was going to go. Is sort of like he is using a dialect to create that persona or to create what he wants people to understand about Bob Dylan. And so I think that that's interesting, but he is using it in a different way, obviously, than Lytle.
Well, he's creating a mask that he wants to create that allows him the freedom and flexibility to do these other kind of things.
Right.
What other people are doing with Forrest are they're creating their own version of him,
right,
hoping that then, like with Lytle,
there's more agency to what Dylan's doing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Lytle's an ideologue. He's trying to create this yeoman farmer that Forrest sort of fits, but doesn't really. And so then he's using this to kind of give credibility to this sort of thing. And also when you look at like how Forrest, we don't have much from Forrest. So when they're using like fussed with the most or fustest with the mostest or first with the most, all these sort of grammatically incorrect sayings that become part of his story, that has its own narrative. I mean, I could spend an entire chapter, and I spent a part of a chapter, but I could spend an entire chapter on how that is used to give credibility or credence to him not being trained or literate, but being beyond literate. Like he's actually smarter than because of this. You know, there's a lot of interesting juxtapositions that happen in all of this, but I think the language part with Forrest may not be the first thing people notice, but it's definitely there.
I think too, like, you know, another thing that struck me, if we look at the parallels, that there are aspects of Dylan's identity or his story that become, you know, that are the result of memory and myth. And I wrote in my notes, I think about, you know, like booing at Newport. There's so many different accounts of whether people booed or whether they didn't boo or what they were booing. And then also the motorcycle accident comes to mind in terms of how we interpret it or understand it, because like you're saying, there's very little about that or said about it, and so people are kind of, you know, doing this apocryphal filling in the gaps of what actually happened based on what was in the news, because, you know, some people it was close to death, other, you know, all the way to the spectrum of, you know, it never happened. Right.
I was about to say that with the motorcycle wreck, you go from it was to no, he really did to, well, he's using it. I think that's interesting. I think there are these moments that we'll never get to the end of. And I think there is something, like, as the cultural historian or the scholar with emphasis on how this stuff is created can have fun with that without trying to get people to understand, well, Pete Seeger did mean this or didn't mean this.
Right.
And I think with with Dylan, there's all these elements where it's like, it's where the gaps are. Newport's not a gap; it's a gap of consensus. The motorcycle accident is a gap of resources. But then there's these other moments, like all of like 1967, which I always find interesting. You know, there's like the story of him at some point hears of Woody's death in October, and then he gets on the train to Nashville. And is then writing, apparently, allegedly, or you think, writing I Dream I Saw St. Augustine. But that is a story where like that seems so laden with personal importance. But then you look at 67 and it's just hard to make sense of it. Like, and you do all the stuff with the basement tapes. We just don't have that much hard factual structure to put on it. We just don't.
We're kind of putting the pieces together through the gaps. And that story about him on the train writing St. Augustine was in the first paper that I saw you present before I even said a word to you. So I would kind of smile.
I just think that's
it's a cool story.
It's open to interpretation. But ultimately, what's fun about it is that he either did have, you know, it's like...
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like the cross that the woman throws on stage, you know, and then a few days later he's looking at it and he has this epiphany that he, you know, has he becomes a born-again Christian. And so, you know, like that's also part of Dylan's mythology.
Well, I love it. And I love all of it. And I love, like, even today you have people literally today saying, did he bring Hard Rain back in because it's in the trailer to the new film? Is he now... He hasn't played that in a while. Why is he playing that now? Is it because it's in the trailer of the new film? And it's like, well, maybe. I love that.
I think it's a good segue to talk about films, Dylan and films. And so, you know, that detail that you include about the Forrest film that never happened, that was supposed to star Gary Cooper, was really interesting. And two things stuck out to me. one is like the understanding that films are entertainment. You alluded to that before when Cockerell was emailing the guy and he was like, you have to have it right. And the guy's like, we're not making that film, because films are not necessarily tied to historical accuracy. They're to make money. And to entertain people, but also the fact versus fiction aspects that filmmakers wrestle with in terms of presenting Forrest. And more to the point, any historical figure. And I love the way that you put this, that you're taking a factual or historical person and putting them in a fictional environment. And so it makes me think about films that are made about Dylan. And so how has that factual person, do you think, how has Dylan been presented in a fictional environment? Where has it been successful? Where do you think it's been unsuccessful, or just in general?
I love to see people point out the inaccuracies, historical inaccuracies. I love that.
Right.
There's a caveat to this, but I love the idea when I see someone say, well, that microphone wasn't introduced until 1967, and
right.
they're showing this in 1967. But I don't think that is the be all, end all, or even interesting enough in terms of the film. If the film is good, mm-hmm. I love that annotation. I eat it up. Right. But I think the film can stand on its own.
Right.
When the film, and you see this in particular like in the 70s and 80s with films dealing with music that are so laughably bad, that's different. Mm-hmm. But we're at a point now where most filmmakers are going to at least sort of try. Right. But we saw this already with the new Dylan movie, where people are saying, well, would that have been, the equipment used or whatever. But I will say I do love that idea. I think that it's important to have that conversation. But the more important thing, if we're going to take the new Dylan biopic as an example, I am much more interested in it being a good film. I want it to be a good film. And I want it to be a smart, intellectually satisfying, emotionally satisfying film. If they have to create a Joan, Bob,
Sylvia Russo.
Right. Well, or the performance that they don't
right.
actually have, or a performance right. that is in '64 that they.
Right.
I get where that would be a little bit. And this is coming from a historian, but I get where that's annoying. But I also would, well, if it works. Mm-hmm. The example I would use is with Mad Men. In the show, in the end of the first season of Mad Men, they use.
Fun fact: this is one of your other obsessions.
Other obsessions is Don't Look Twice, and Don't no wait, I screwed up the song, but they use a Dylan song that is, I don't know, 2 months. Mm-hmm. It's set at a time that's probably 2 months away from when he recorded it.
Right.
And that does not cause discomfort, But and the show is about history, but then the right. show is to the point where with Mad Men, they make sure they look up to see what the weather is in New York mm-hmm. for a certain of these times. If it was right. rainy, they're going to make it rain. That's the level of detail. But then they put this song in there. Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, which is then a chronology put into this. And I think, well, does it work? And so I'm sort of frustrating me myself on this level. This is a very long preface to your answering your question. But I think it's this because in the next season, then they use the Decemberists who weren't even, right. So there's this idea. And I understand where you want to hold people accountable to these things and you want a filmmaker that is historically right. accurate. But I would rather have a filmmaker who is historically engaged rather than historically obsessed with the
detail, the minutia.
You don't want to see him, Dylan holding like a BC Rich 1985 neon guitar.
In 1964.
Yeah, that part, yeah. But at the same time, that guild was a 64,
Yeah.
I love that. I have to restate. I love that annotation exists. I love that conversation. Mm-hmm. But I'd rather have a film that is deeply resonant emotionally and historically mm-hmm. than have to be like a documentary of it.
Those details aren't going to ruin the film as long as the film tells you something compelling. And we were just talking about previously the Mangold interview about the film, and his perspective sort of showing that Dylan as this person who has something extraordinary, as we know. And so, you can kind of recap what we were talking about off camera.
Well, I don't think I went into this going, great, a biopic. I didn't go into going, oh my goodness, finally. I did think that I like Chalamet. I think he's really great in he's really great in some really great films, and he's fine in some kind of lesser films. But when he's good, he's really great. And I think that was like, okay, I could see that.
Right.
And you go into it thinking, well, maybe a larger audience, that's kind of cool, or a different audience, and you're thinking that it's just going to be a different. Where I'm thinking is not like, is it going to move the needle in any way? I think it's going to create new conversations about Dylan.
Yeah.
And I think that that's cool. And I think with TikTok, when we had like the jacket with doing the
Dylan core?
Dylan core, where he's like into too thin a jacket.
Yeah.
That's hilarious. It's really funny. There's some really great meme pages that are just like almost to the verge of absurdity.
Right.
I love all of this. I think
Right.
the conversation's cool. It's not about, in my mind, whether it sells anything. I think we're so beyond that conversation. I think what it's going to do is create this new world. Now, with the director who gave an interview with Rolling Stone,
yeah.
listening to the long form of it, I think he's tapped into something, and that's what I'm interested in. He's tapped into something.
That was encouraging to me, because not that I was skeptical. I mean, I'm super excited. I saw I watched the trailer. I can't even count how many times, and I'm excited about it because I think you're right. It's going to open up Dylan to new audiences, but the way that he framed his presentation of Dylan to me was encouraging, because it wasn't, I don't think it was going to be a bland narrative in a way. It's trying to capture maybe the essence of Dylan in some way. I don't know if you felt the same way.
No, I think so, and I think with the trailer, I was, Laura has her, Tincture has her little. Her small group.
Oh, I missed that
Zoom.
day. Yeah.
And I said in there that I love trailers. Like a good trailer, better than the movie.
It's my favorite part of the movie.
Yeah, and I thought it was a good trailer. I was like, this is a great trailer. And there are trailers that are really good that I think are better than the movie. And I think there are really good trailers can be really great trailers to really great films. I don't have an interest in comic books that much, and I don't have a big interest in Joker. And I saw that every time I've seen that trailer, I'm like, this is now all I'm going to think about for the next. Like, I'm excited about this movie because I think the trailer's great. And then I read on social media, people are like, "What's the stupidest trailer ever?" I'm like, "Oh my goodness, I thought it looked great." But I'm not in the world of Joker.
Right.
I'm not in the world of like, well, again,
I thought it was interesting, and I'm not in the comic book world either. But I was just like, all right,
well, I'm into this. What the director said that I really caught. And I was like, this is great, is that he goes, this is a story, and the words he used, he goes, this is a story of a man who was choking to death in Minnesota, and then he leaves his family and friends, creates a new family, creates new friends, finds himself choking to death again.
And that's what Dylan liked about it.
Well, that's the key. And it's like,
right.
And then you're like, okay, so it's not Newport. It is, right. But it's not about that. It's about this other thing. And that story, that journey, and that's why I love so wholeheartedly Inside Llewyn Davis. Because I think Llewyn Davis, which is being coy with the Dylan story,
right.
and is also being coy with all real characters, but also being fictional,
right.
is also getting at. There are scenes in that movie that I think about weekly, and there's a tone, and then there is a story there that I think is very, very, very moving. And this movie could have that same element, dealing with a much more non-fictional component.
I agree with that. So
why were you laughing?
I was laughing at Llewyn Davis because I will just watch it, on and off. Like whenever it's on, I'll watch it. And even if it's on twice in one day, I will watch it twice in one day if I happen to see it's on. There's something about that movie that
Are you on the Llewyn Davis channel? Like, what in the world are you watching?
Just like if I turn the TV on in the morning, I'm scrolling through the guide. I'm like, oh, that's on, and I'll put it on.
I can imagine you talking about like Goodfellas or something that's on all the time. Oh, and Llewyn Davis is on again. I will say, every time I watch that movie, the cat shows up. I get nervous every single time. I know the cat's gonna be okay.
That's what I
get nervous every single time. It's like
not,
Chekhov's cat. Like that cat shows up. I'm like,
Right.
oh, he cannot own. And the other
That's what I was laughing about the cat, if I'm being honest.
I'll also say, weirdly enough, when he makes scrambled eggs,
Mm-hmm.
he makes scrambled eggs when he's staying over. He's couch surfing, and he
Yeah.
makes scrambled eggs. I think about that scene more than I should, and I don't want to really explore as to why.
Okay.
But it's interesting to me. But
This is going to be your just walk away, Renee moment.
just walk away.
Yeah,
Court likes the
people are
scrambled
gonna-
egg scene.
Everybody's going to ask you about the scrambled egg
What's
scene
with the
now.
scrambled egg scene? It's like, that's interesting to me. I'm probably going to go back and realize that there is no scrambled egg scene. It's like, what was I?
But there is a cat, so.
There is a cat. There's a scrambled egg scene too,
Yeah.
and it's not even a part of anything.
Right.
Anyway, yes.
But I do think we can talk about the documentaries as a separate entity in terms of creating identity. And so how do they play a role in crafting identity? Also in memory too, because we have so much distance from like Eat the Document, Don't Look Back. And then even when I was thinking about this, the Scorsese documentary we're 20 years away, almost 20 years away from it at this point, because it's 2005. So how much do you think that helps in constructing the myth?
I almost caught myself a minute ago because I was as kind of creating this binary as if there's like a biopic, which is a fiction, and then
Right.
documentary, which is non.
Right, because they're
And it's not like that at all, of course.
yeah,
and
they're
being
still constructed through filming and editing.
And there's nothing worse
Yeah.
than a terrible documentary. I will say that No Direction Home, the Scorsese, is. I think there are fewer documents that are more emotionally satisfying and interesting than that one.
Yeah.
I think that documentary, I think the soundtrack, which I guess is technically part of the bootleg series,
Right.
is undervalued and under
Do we need to have a full
reported.
discussion
I
about that?
love that soundtrack. I love that documentary. When we first met, it was actually on the eve of
I was going to bring this up, the Rolling Thunder review. Go
Rolling
ahead.
Thunder review, and what's so funny about Rolling Thunder, I watched it. I was like, okay, there's something going on here. I'm not going to be smart enough to say I picked up on it immediately, but there's some weird things. It's a little.
All right, when they split the words, it gave me pause. But when they said, and actually today, when we're filming this, is the 8th of August, and it's the 50th.
My mother's birthday. Happy birthday,
Happy
Mom.
birthday. Happy birthday, Mrs. Carney. But also, it's the 50th anniversary of Nixon resigning.
Oh, yeah.
And so
yeah,
when they were
yeah.
talking about the bicentennial in relation to Nixon, that's when it kind of dawned on me that this was a farce.
But what's interesting about that documentary is that how angry people got.
Right.
Like they're still angry talking about it. I know people who are involved in, like Rob Stoner is constantly talking about how insulting it was to make and the people who were in the band and who were doing that kind of stuff, I could see where they were hoping for something that was like not that. But the anger people have for that, I think, is sort of funny. I think that I don't know what to make of that documentary, honestly.
I think it's part of
It's part of this whole
myth
building,
creation, but I think in a way, like the question I asked was like, is it part of further constructing Dylan myth? Is it poking fun at it, or is it both?
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean,
it's impossible to tell like how much of it is meant to be.
maybe we need more distance in 5 years.
And I haven't. There are the stuff I go back to with that film are actually the things that are kind of just played straight that are like interesting, like him on the reservation, or I love the footage they have of like the Plymouth Rock stuff and that kind of thing. I think it's still valuable. I don't think I hold it to the same level as the Scorsese, because that really is like really moving.
But
Well, it's just like that's a really moving document, and they were able to get some interviews that are really, really, I think, go down there as like you talk about the Nobel, you talk about you talk about the conversations he has in that documentary. Those are touchstones now of kind of Dylan's studies.
Music Care speech,
Yeah. Those are the touchstones that people kind of rotate around. I think that. I don't think it's on that level, but I think it's something that I don't know. I think I'm more interested in why are you so angry with it? What I mean, because of the expectation. Well, that's fair, I suppose. But
I do think though, when I look at it, I see him parroting documentaries. Like you brought up the Burns Civil War documentary, particularly with Shelby Foote, and like how maybe And even maybe the one he made that we think is so beautiful. I love No Direction Home, but maybe they're parroting in that, in how it does create myth, and he's then giving you something that we expect. Like you're saying, our response is I wasn't upset about it, but people were so upset about it because they expected it to be truthful, to be documenting something, and it was just parody of that.
What's sly about it, though, is I think that someone like Ken Burns, there should be more outrage about what he does. I think he's a very talented filmmaker, and I think some of his films are quite good. And I think Civil War has a lot to recommend to it, but he's also he's using a few historical, like historians, scholars talking, like Barbara J. Fields and others talking, to give credibility to a story that's also kind of really weirdly balanced. And like, the reason we know anything about Forrest in the 90s, because in the 90s we have a resurgence of Forrest stuff, is because of Ken Burns, and most because of Shelby Foote, who becomes the star of the show. And none of that is anything other than, a subjective retelling of certain glancing stories, but that becomes then fact.
Right.
And I think people wanted something like that with Dylan. And it'd be great. Like, honestly, would you like a 9-hour documentary about all these? Of course. And we get bits and pieces of that with Scorsese, but I mean,
you put
it'd be amazing.
Ronaldo and Clara in it, we've got 4 down.
Yeah. But all the other thing too is that we're not critical enough of documentaries, I think, generally.
Right. But that, I think, is part of the point of like how much those earlier documentaries helped create his identity, even with his participation. And this is his participation too. And he's kind of poking fun at that, I think.
Right.
And he's trying to bring that to the forefront of like how they're just as constructed as any other narrative film or any other narrative told about him. And that creates the entire Dylan mythology. And then in terms of your book, creates sort of the memory. It becomes fixed as our memory as something real.
I think with Rolling Thunder too, what can't be completely dismissed is what our dear colleague Harry would argue is that it's just comedy. It's a comedic, sort of funny take on things. And I bet at some point there was a conversation like, what if we did this other thing? And I think there is like a funny element to it. Not everything has to be like maybe a serious ideological take or a take down, really. But I think it's all of those things. And and again, it kind of comes down to, like, is it successful or is it not? I'm much more interested in that conversation of is it successful rather than is it, factual or that kind of thing. Hopefully the biopic is great. And hopefully on Christmas Day, 2024, everyone gets... Are
you going to be in Houston on Christmas?
I don't know.
Well, we should go if you're in Houston.
We'll go to IPIC and get
Go together.
But I do think that...
And then we can record our hot takes.
Hot takes, yes. That's exactly what I'm good at. Weirdly negative. No, I just think that's what I'm looking forward to. And then I'm, of course, wanting to see all of the academic filigree talking about it. But to go back to Mad Men, as I like to say almost every day, to go back to Mad Men, that is not the be-all, end-all of historical accuracy. And it's not, there can be a larger conversation there where the soundtrack or a comment or a word can also, that might be out of step with what have happened, is also giving emotional credibility to something that I think is important beyond the historical. But that's also why I'm a cultural historian, not like a...
I think that's a good place to end that conversation and ask, what are you working on now? Dylan related, which I think I know, Woody or otherwise.
I've got a small thing that I'm going to tease that I can't say much about that I hope to come out. I hope not to come out, but I hope to come out, but I'd like to see it become something that is a little Dylan-y, a little Woody, a little... Woody-y. And we'll see, fingers crossed on that. I am working with a dear friend on Dylan in the 80s.
Again. I just want to say thank you for agreeing to work
see.
with me again and
It seems
index with me again.
don't like that it seems easy right now.
I know.
Don't like that feeling. Well, this seems to be coming together.
We would also
Don't
like
that.
to thank our dear friend Grayley Heron for already submitting his chapter.
Grayley is
a machine.
the model citizen.
He really is.
In our world. There is one other piece of Forrest stuff I want to finish up and I'm not going to suggest close the door, but so there's a little bit of a Forrest thing I want to finish. There's a purposefully vague small thing that I want to do that kind of combines some of these conversations, but it's going to be much more self-contained, small. And then the larger thing, which I think you were kind of talking about, is that I am sort of piecing together, I would like to do, and planning on doing, would like to actually complete a monograph on Dylan, but looking at Dylan kind of through these conversations of history and somewhat how his take on it and how he's connecting to it, but also then how it's being used around him. And I think that that's probably after I can go through the projects that are on the desk, that's the project that I would like to. I'm in an era, I told myself this is going to be my era of no, and I've said yes.
You've said that for a while.
Yeah, I know.
And you say
it's
yes
an error.
to everything.
It's an error. ERROR. It's the error of no. And it's kind of like there's so many interesting things, and then when you have people who are doing great things around you, and then they invite you to do conferences, or we're doing this other kind of book. Those are why would you ever say no to that? Like, these are the great things about what we do. There's a lot of difficulty about it. And the Forrest book, to wrap that up, the Forrest book was something that I lived with a long time, not just Forrest, but with the book. And you teach a lot, I teach, but we have comparable teaching, but heavy teaching.
It's not competition.
And it's not competition. And if it was, the two of us are not the, we're not looking at gold and silver on this one. But it's something that's important to keep in mind, that to get anything out and maintain teaching and do all this stuff is
to a level that our work ethic requires.
Right. That is part of that. And I remember it was just at COVID shutdown, so 2020, and I had just seen that there was a book coming out on Forrest and the myth, and I remember thinking, I can't not do this. I've been working on and off of this for too long. And I got really sort of like, uh-oh. And I got the book immediately as I could, as early as I could. And I read it, and I was so overwhelmingly relieved that A, it was nothing I would have done, and B, useful, good. Part of it was quite good. And not to say that part of it was not good, but it was just like, it wasn't anything I was going to do. And the stuff that did kind of touch on my stuff was completely usable. And I remember thinking, I'm not going to, I can't let this one go. And so it was in 20 when I was like, okay, let's finish this up. And here we are 4 years later. I mean, academic books are...
It's a slow crawl.
It's a slow crawl.
Yeah.
But that was sort of the reminder to me that I have something to say, and that I have something, I think, of value to add to a conversation. And I think it's something that oftentimes you kind of wonder, like, what do I have to add to this? There's so much stuff on Dylan. There's so much stuff on music. What am I saying that is unique or important at all? And sometimes it's easy to be like, well, other people are saying something better. But there is something about the Forrest story that I was like, there's something there that I think is unique in a way that I am putting it together that I think is valuable. And I think that is not anything other than me kind of standing up for something I've been working on for a long time and saying, I think there's something kind of unique and novel about how this stuff can be discussed and brought together. And I think that if I'm successful, the book is also sort of, and I hate to say this after all of this conversation, but the book is sort of funny. Like, I think it's a book that is sort of, it's not dry. I don't think it's dry.
No.
I think it's actually sort of funny. And I think there's a part to how you can put all it together, I think is sort of I stand behind it.
I think you were incredibly successful in all of those things. And I know I always have to preface when I give you compliments that you know I'm your friend and I'm going to support anything that you do. But I think you've been incredibly successful in crafting or carving out your perspective in this book. And there is humor in it. I mean, there are parts, I told you there are moments I'd stop and be like, God, that was such a beautifully written sentence, and that's the writing teacher in me, writing professor in me. But it's such a solid take on this complex character and figure from history. And I'm so proud of you. And I remember when you sent me the picture of it, the manuscript complete, and you're like, it's done. And I was proud of you then, and I'm even more proud of you now that I've read it. And I can't wait for the world to read what you've written.
Well, I appreciate that. Are you going to show everybody the book?
She
has a PDF. It's
I have a PDF. I cannot.
We don't have the book. I don't have the physical book yet.
And I did not print out the PDF, so I can show you a picture of it on Amazon, and you can pre-order, and I'll put the link and all the links of where to find Court, because he's worth listening to on just about every subject, including Mad Men and donuts. And
I didn't even talk about Mad Men.
I know.
That's
maybe
coming
another
up.
episode. So is there any?
What'd you say after Mad Men?
I said donuts. I don't know. I was just pulling, oat milk lattes, whatever you want to talk about.
No.
Is there anything else you'd like to discuss?
I don't think so.
All right.
This is great.
Yeah, it was so fun. I like to talk to you. I'll just do it off camera anytime.
This is great. You should see like the outtakes, the 7-hour outtake of
this poor crew.
You can see the sun setting, the sun rising. Yeah, that'd be great.
This is why our meetings go so long. But thank you so much for coming literally to our home this time, and for sharing your work and sharing your ideas. And as your friend, I love you, and I love your wife, and now your dog. And I'm so glad that we are that we're friends and that we get to do this.
Yeah, to bring the dog into this.
I did have to bring the dog into it. I'm a dog person.
No, it's great. It's all wonderful. Things are all really great. And I'm very thankful for not only you doing this, which is the first real interview I've had with the book, but also like the detail that you brought to it. And I knew you would, but like the detail of the questions. And I read the questions. I was like, I need to reread. I was like, do I have time to reread the book to kind of refresh, keep me engaged with what happens? Like, did I write about that? No, I'm kidding. But they were really great, and I think this is really fun. And connecting it to Dylan is weird, but it seemed like it worked. So
yeah, it was great.
No one's going to get too upset.
I hope not. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in, and look for us on the first of every month where a new episode of Infinity Goes Up on Trial drops. Thanks a lot.